Okay, good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gary Mond. I'm the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, and it's wonderful to see so many of you online tonight. Our guest this evening, I think, needs no introduction to the vast majority of you. Mark Regev was the former Israeli ambassador to the UK between 2016 and 2020. He then served as a senior advisor for foreign affairs and international communications to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And currently, Mark is the chair of the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations at Reichman University in Herzliya in Israel. Mark, because he's no longer the ambassador and he's no longer works for the government, his views that he expresses are his own. He is not speaking on behalf of Israel. He is not speaking on behalf of the Israeli government. So this might mean he is freer to say what he would like to say. The opinions he expresses will be his own views. Now, we can do it just a little bit differently tonight. I'm going to ask a few questions, which Mark will answer. I've had so far 5 members of the National Jewish Assembly write to me with questions, and I will then ask those questions, and I'll name the people whose questions they are. And then we'll throw it open in the usual way, whereby you need to raise your virtual hand. And you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a button there that says raise hand. If you do that, and I will take the questions in the order in which I see them. We're going to be finishing around the 8:15 mark. So don't forget also Mark is 2 hours ahead of us. He's in Israel. So let me kick off with the first question. Although this meeting is primarily about the ludicrous idea of recognizing a Palestinian state and the consequences, I just want to ask you, Mark, how do you see things going in the war in Gaza at the moment? How do you see things developing, particularly with regard to our twin major objectives of trying to free the hostages and trying to eradicate Hamas and remove them from power? What's the latest, and how do you see things going as we move into the future? Mark.
So Israel is preparing to go into Gaza City, which is the last major Hamas stronghold. The assumption is that in Gaza City also there are a number of the 48 hostages, some 20 of them alive, still left in Gaza. And it could be some difficult fighting. You will recall earlier in the week, we lost 4 soldiers in combat in Gaza in a firefight with Hamas. They were from the Armor Corps, and it touched me personally because one of the soldiers was from my community, from Modi'in area. And our local cemetery is unfortunately too full of young men and women who lost their lives on October 7th or afterwards. And it's this is the price we're paying. But I think it's crucial that this ends in a way that we achieve our goals. And they are that Hamas will no longer be in charge of the Gaza Strip, that when this is over, Gaza will be demilitarized and no longer a threat to Israel. And of course, very importantly, that we get all the hostages home. And those goals remain the goals of the state of Israel. And I think there's overwhelming support inside Israel to achieve those 3 goals.
Thank you. So turning now to the issue of recognition of a Palestinian state, exactly why do you think Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and other countries have chosen this time to embark on what I personally view is a ludicrous idea of recognizing a fictitious country? What lies behind it? What are their objectives? Because for sure, I'm sure that the objective is not exactly going to advance peace. But what do you think the objectives are? What do you think the thinking process, to the extent there is a thinking process, lying behind the decision to recognize a Palestinian state?
So there's a very serious process underway led by the Americans, led by the White House, specifically by the President, Trump, and by his senior advisor, Witkoff. And they have been working on a hostage deal that releases the hostages and that ends the war with Gaza and ends Hamas rule over the enclave. In other words, a package that would bring about a peaceful end to this where once again hostages come home and Hamas no longer runs the Gaza Strip. And we've been applying military pressure on Hamas because up until now they haven't been willing to release the hostages, or of course they're very reticent to give up control of Gaza. And so we've been, as I say, ratcheting up the military pressure. And this is, if you want to see a ceasefire in Gaza, if you want to see an end to the war, you should be supporting this process, because this is the only game in town, right? It's American-led. They've got the Arab mediators. Israel wants this to work. Over a month ago, there was the Witkoff plan on the table. Israel accepted it. Hamas rejected it. Everyone thought we were very close to ending the war, and it was just thrown away by Hamas. And last week, the American president put a new program on the table. Once again, Israel accepted it. Hamas rejected it. And what are the reasons Hamas is rejecting it? So there are three reasons. Reason number one is that they believe, they understand they're losing this militarily, but they believe that there is international pressure on Israel to stop the war. Stopping the war, leaving them in charge of the Gaza Strip, which means they can rearm and prepare the next October 7th massacre, right? That's what they want. They know they can't win militarily, but they believe if they grit their teeth and hold out, there'll be international pressure on Israel to stop the war before we achieve our goals. I think they're wrong. But when people in Europe talk about recognition of a Palestinian state and or a ceasefire, they are giving succor to Hamas, because it's difficult for them, but if they believe they just have to hold out and, as I said, grit their teeth and wait, and Israel will be forced to end the war, why would they make a concession now? Why would they compromise? They think the international community is going to save their bacon, so to speak. You know, Jews and Muslims don't eat pork, yes, but from a figurative point of view. The other thing they released like 6 weeks ago, I think it was maybe 5 weeks ago, they released the terrible hostage videos of our hostages looking like they've just come out of concentration camps, yes? Very difficult videos, very difficult to watch. And I think this is part of their psychological warfare. They also want pressure on the Israeli government internally, that the Israeli government gives up on its war efforts, because we'll be so, psychological warfare. Israeli society will be so terrorized that the pressure to get the hostages out will mean that we'll make concessions on everything else. It was clear it was part of a campaign. So this is how Hamas thinks it can save itself: international pressure and domestic pressure. So if I sum it up, those people around the world, especially the Europeans, in this case also the Canadians and the Australians and others who've been talking about recognizing a Palestinian state and have been calling for a ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power, yes? They are, I think, irrelevant to the process, in that the process, as I said, is American-led. They're not part of that. They're onlookers. And this is, if I can be undiplomatic, and I'm no longer a diplomat, it's almost like small children crying out for attention. Okay, but let's be clear. They are actually, if they are giving succor to Hamas, if they believe because of the international pressure Israel is going to be forced to end the war, why would they ever make a concession? And so it's not just they're being saying things that are irrelevant. They're actually maybe being counterproductive. They're undermining the chances to get a deal that will end the war and bring the hostages home. And so it's very negative. And it all fits together. The calls for a Palestinian state, that means Hamas thinks their strategy is winning. And at the same time, the calls for a ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power, because it sounds very nice. I can understand why people across the UK, normal people, good people, can think, let's just end the bloodshed and have a ceasefire. Yes, I understand why that could be a popular position. But people, you have to finish the sentence. A ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power. That's not even a Band-Aid solution, because we know who Hamas is, and we'll have another October 7th just in a matter of time. That's a foregone conclusion. And so I think it's crucial that people understand that when Western governments are either calling for a ceasefire or calling to recognize a Palestinian state, they're not helping peace. They're not helping ending the war. They're actually undermining the very serious effort that's underway to end the war.
Thank you, Mark. Just looking at the domestic issues within the individual countries which are planning to recognize a so-called Palestinian state, it seems that on the whole they are left-wing governments and they're very concerned about large Islamist populations and concerned that they may lose votes if they don't do this. I don't know to what extent you believe that's a factor, because in some cases, where there's a slightly more centrist or even conservative opposition, they're not supporting this idea of recognizing this fictitious state. I wonder, would you agree with that, or do you have a different view?
So I think it's true in some cases, places where you have left of center parties ruling a country, and then on the more radical left, you have, Palestine's become a holy grail, and so they want to feed the beast, so to speak. It's it's domestic politics, but to be fair, we have domestic politics in Israel too. Every democracy has domestic politics. But I would say this: those leaders who say we want to recognize a Palestinian state because that'll advance peace, it's a pipe dream. It's ridiculous.
Exactly.
In 2012, the UN General Assembly voted to recognize a Palestinian state. Yes. And there was a huge party in Ramallah that night celebrating the fact that the UN General Assembly had recognized a Palestinian state. And in the morning, Palestinians in Ramallah and across Judea and Samaria, across the West Bank, woke up in the morning and nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. A piece of paper that didn't change anything. And this is the politics of theater. This is the politics of virtue signaling. If it wasn't a succor for Hamas, yes, if it wasn't something that gave Hamas encouragement, it really is ridiculous.
Okay.
And I would say to these Europeans, and if they maybe some of them are very sincere, they want to advance peace. I want them to think about the following: the current Palestinian leadership on the West Bank, right? The current Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, under President Mahmoud Abbas, you're going to recognize him and his government as a state. You're going to upgrade their representation. This is a government on the West Bank that has refused publicly to condemn October 7th terrorist attacks. This is a government on the West Bank that pays terrorists. We had an incident just 2 days ago in Jerusalem where 6 civilians were shot by 2 Palestinian terrorists. Now, their families will get money from the Palestinian Authority because they have a special fund in the Palestinian budget to pay perpetrators of terrorist violence against Israeli civilians. A special fund. And the longer your sentence, in other words, the more you kill, the more Israeli civilians you kill, the more money you get. And it's obscene. And the Americans have spoken out against this. We've spoken out against this. But it nevertheless is the situation. And what is these so-called, do-gooders who want to advance peace in the Middle East? What are they saying? They're saying, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state in the aftermath of October 7th, the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. We're going to recognize a Palestinian state, upgrade a Palestinian government that refuses to have democratic elections. I mean, I think President Abbas was elected some 20 years ago for a 4-year term. I mean, that refuses to recognize the legitimacy of the Jewish state, that refuses to renounce terrorism, continues to fund. In other words, if they were to put all these conditions, we will recognize a Palestinian state if the Palestinians do A, B, and C, I could still have an argument with them, but we'd have a more serious argument. But they're giving this present to the Palestinians for what? And I would ask the following questions. If these European and British and other leaders really believe in peace, what incentive do the Palestinians have to moderate their positions if they get diplomatic prizes without moderation? And I want them to think about that.
Yeah, one question that is sometimes asked quite a bit in the diaspora is how bad will the situation get vis-a-vis diplomatic relations between Israel and some of these European countries? It's certainly Spain has raised the bar in the last couple of days. Could it get as bad as threatening diplomatic relations? What is your opinion on how bad it could get?
I don't know. It could get worse, especially Israel could decide to respond. I mean, if we've already done it with Australia. Australia has stopped giving visas to Israelis, not all Israelis, but some prominent Israelis. So the Israeli government turned around and said, we'll stop giving visas to Australians, right? In other words, it can be a two-way street.
Mm.
And you could have problems. You could have more problems in these relationships. But if one has a historical perspective, we've been through this before in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. We were fighting for our lives. The Russians, the Soviet Union at the time, were sending weapons to the Arabs, the Syrians, and the Egyptians who were attacking Israel. And the Americans wanted to support us, and not a single European country allowed for the American planes bringing vital ammunition to Israel to refuel those planes on their soil, even on American bases on those soils. Not Britain, not Germany, not France, not anyone. The Portuguese actually were a bit better than everyone else, and they allowed us to, I think it's called the Azore Islands, they allowed the American aircraft. So we've had problems with Europe in the past. It's sad that it happens today in the 21st century. It's not that I like it, but I want to quote Golda Meir. We in Israel had a female prime minister, a woman leader, 10 years before Margaret Thatcher was elected in the United Kingdom. We beat Britain on being a democracy that elected a woman. And I'm proud of that. And Golda Meir famously said, and I think it's true, that she prefers a bad editorial. You would call it in England, you'd call it a bad leader, yes, a negative leading article against Israel, than a very nice and eloquent obituary, right? Israel is fighting a necessary war that was forced upon us. We have to defeat Hamas. That's the bottom line. And if we get some bad publicity and there are some bumps in the road with our relations with Europe along the way, that's secondary. We have to win the war.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, I think it could be argued that the last time Britain and Israel were truly friends was in 1956, before either you or I were born, in the Suez War.
Can I tell you, Britain and Israel have had, I mean, historically, there was the Balfour Declaration, and then there was the White Paper, which in 1939, which was like, we felt it like we were stabbed in the back. And there was 56 that you've said. There were times when we had a very good relationship and times when we had a less good relationship. It's all relative. I mean, Britain's probably a lot better than Spain today, yes, and better than Ireland. But we would hope that the British would be more sympathetic than they are, I think.
So my last question before I start asking questions from the audience is, what is your view of what happened a couple of days ago in Doha, in the bombing of Doha, and hopefully taking out some Hamas leaders? We don't yet know whether they did or they didn't. And what are likely to be the consequences?
So apparently there's going to be some Arab League meeting in Qatar over the next few days. Well, they'll probably condemn us, yes?
Of course.
But I'd remind you that after the attack on Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981, they also all united to condemn us. And today everyone thinks that Israel did a wonderful thing. What's the bottom line? Israel wasn't attacking Qatar. Israel attacked the leadership of Hamas that is situated in Qatar. And the question has to be asked, why is Qatar hosting Hamas? Today is the anniversary of 9/11, of the September 11th terrorist attacks against the United States by Al-Qaeda. And following those attacks, which proportionally our attack was bigger, if you look at it from a per capita point of view, yes? The attack of 7th October 23 was larger in the number of civilian deaths. Not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it was larger. A bigger proportion of our population was killed in one day than Americans were killed on September 11th. But nevertheless, when there was an international coalition against Afghanistan, not because Afghanistan attacked America, but because Afghanistan was giving shelter, was hosting the leaders of Al-Qaeda who attacked the United States. And that was supported bipartisan in the United States and by Britain and by most of Europe, yes. They said, you know, this Taliban regime should not be hosting groups like Al-Qaeda. So Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas is recognized internationally as a terrorist organization, not just by Israel, but by the United States, by Britain, by the European Union, by Japan, by Australia. the Qataris are hosting this organization. Now, we did not attack Qatar as Qatar. We attacked Hamas leadership inside Qatar. And I want that to be remembered. And I also want the following to be remembered. The terrorists who attack Jews and try to murder us, they can't be given immunity. On the contrary, we will find them. Golda Meir, I spoke about her before. She organized after the 1972 massacre at the Olympic Games in Munich, terrible massacre of the Israeli athletes. She sent out our security services to hunt down and eliminate all the terrorists involved in that terrible, terrible act of bloodshed and violence. And slowly but surely, they were eliminated. Just as America in 2011, almost a decade after the 9/11 attacks, went into Pakistan, a friendly state from the point of view of the United States. In the Cold War, Pakistan was America's ally against the Soviet Union. Went into Pakistan, didn't inform the Pakistani government heads up, no heads up. They went in there to take out bin Laden. And I think that's how the Israeli strike on Qatar should be seen.
Thank you. Right, now I'm going to just ask some of the questions on behalf of some of our members. The first one is from Stephen Collins. Stephen asks, does the casual labeling of any state action against Israel, for example, recent Spanish measures, as anti-Semitism, not devalue the actual anti-Semitism experienced by individuals in Europe and elsewhere? Relatedly, does the Israeli government ever consider the effects of its actions and statements have for Jews in the diaspora? Mark.
So the second type, of course, we do. We put that into our equation that we know what happens here can affect Jewish communities across the globe. And we urge governments to do everything they can. And I think the British government has been pretty good on this. Standing behind the Jewish community, helping CST and other groups to protect the Jews. I think probably Britain's a good example of how these things should work. But on the first part of your question, can you repeat the first part so I make sure I answer it correctly?
Does the casual labeling of any state action against Israel?
Look, I don't think everyone who criticizes Israel is anti-Semitic, right? I mean, the Israelis themselves like to criticize their government. We're a democracy, and so people who've got something to say can say it. I would say, though, it's a mistake to take the pressure off Hamas. If all the pressure is on Israel, why would Hamas ever, compromise? And I think that's wrong. I do think there is anti-Semitism. When someone is shouting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, yes? That they're saying Israel has no right to exist, not in any borders. You're denying my people's right to independence and sovereignty. You're denying my people's right to self-determination. I think that's anti-Semitism. Ultimately, that's returning the Jews to 1939, where they're once again an unprotected minority, dependent on the goodwill of others, and denied a homeland and denied our right to defend ourselves. But so that I consider that anti-Semitism. But just criticism, I wouldn't consider anti-Semitism. Though, if criticism is systematic, and if people use words like the Spanish Prime Minister did, Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, I think that has to be considered very, if not anti-Semitism, very close to anti-Semitism. Let's look at this genocide charge, if you'll allow me, Gary, for 1 second, right?
Sure.
Hamas attacked us on October 7th, and 1,200 people were killed. 1,200, 1,200, 1,200 people were killed. If Hamas had the capability, would they have killed, instead of 1,200, would they have killed 12,000? What's the answer, Gary?
Yes.
Of course they would have. Would they have killed 120,000 if they could have? The answer is yes. And you can keep going up. Would they have killed 1,200,000 if they could have? What's the answer? How do we know this? Because we saw how they behaved on October 7th. And we know what they say and what's written in their charter. And they believe every Jew, every Israeli is a legitimate target for murder. They say it openly. That's what they believe. Yeah. So who is the genocidal organization? On the other hand, Israel, look, we have power that we don't use. That's very clear. We have capabilities. I mean, this war could have been over in 3 weeks had Israel used all the power at its ability. But we're a democratic society that works in the framework of the rule of law. This this genocide charge, I think, is pretty close to anti-Semitism because it's so divorced from reality. It's like, in the Middle Ages, the Jews were accused of, poisoning the wells and spreading the plague, and the blood libel, which actually was a British invention. The idea that Jews, kidnap and murder Christian children for their blood at the time of Pesach and Easter, so we can, genocide is a bit like, you accuse Israel of genocide, it's a bit like that. And can I just remind you, of course, there's been innocent people caught up in the crossfire. Of course, there's been collateral damage in Gaza. But the whole idea that Israel wants to kill Gazans, Israel wants to kill the Palestinians in Gaza, that's it. If we wanted to kill them, we're doing a very, very bad job of it, yes? Exactly. We're making an effort, a maximum effort, to try to keep the level of collateral damage down. And in fact, if you look, Gary, I'm sorry, I'm going on a monologue, I apologize. But if you actually look at similar confrontations in urban areas where Western democratic societies fought terrorists, specifically ISIS was fought by a Western coalition, which Britain was part of, in Syria and in Iraq. And there was some urban fighting there. Look at the statistics for ratio of combat deaths versus civilian deaths, and you'll see that Israel and Gaza actually does surprisingly well.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. So moving on to the next question from Jeffrey Smith. In terms of statecraft, what will be the effect of this week's bombing in Qatar on the hostages in Gaza, the Abraham Accords, and relations with the USA? So really building on what you were saying earlier.
So he asked three good questions, and I don't know. We have to wait and see. Yes, yeah, it's clear that the Trump administration is very important for them to sort of disassociate themselves from the Israeli strike against Hamas in Qatar. I think they've got an important relationship there. Their largest base in the Middle East is in Qatar. The Qataris had a visit by the president earlier this year. He went to 3 Arab countries. He went to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, and the UAE. They want to give him an airplane for Air Force One. Yes, there are relationships there. There are economic relationships between the two countries. There's a military relationship. And it was important for the Americans to disassociate themselves from what we did. Is it much more than that? Difficult to tell. How the Abraham Accords countries will respond? Well, a lot of them have responded verbally. But you will remember, Gary, that it wasn't that long ago that the other Gulf countries were very upset with Qatar. They're upset with Qatar because Qatar supports militant Islam. It has relationships with the Muslim Brotherhood. Its network, Al Jazeera, puts out that sort of propaganda the whole time. There was even a situation when I was the ambassador in London where the other Arab countries actually put an embargo on Qatar. It was so bad, the relationship. And so though there are public statements, everyone is uniting to condemn Israel, I think amongst the Arab countries, there might be a separate way which people are saying in quiet than they are publicly.
Excellent. The next question I find very intriguing, and I'd like to hear your view on it. It's from Farah Josephs, one of our members. Israel's strike on Hamas operatives in Doha would have involved flying its jets over the skies of Arab countries like Saudi Arabia. What are the logistical complications involved in such an operation? And how did these countries fail to detect 15 unauthorized jets when their airspace is under rigorous monitoring?
So I can't go into that. First of all, I don't know all of it. I just know that we routinely do fly over Arab countries. I mean, when we bombed Iran, yes, we had Israeli planes flying over Tehran, yes, in the 14-day war. And how did they get there? Yes, and what was their route? And so I'd rather not go into things that I shouldn't talk about. All I can tell you is that we get to these places when we need to get to these places.
Understood. Okay. And the next question is from Michael Sampson. What should the Jewish community be doing right now to strongly object to our Labour government stating that it is willing to recognise a Palestinian state? And is it actually 2 states or even 3-state solution? Thereby rewarding Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, also bearing in mind that the UK continues to fund UNRWA, and this government has failed to prescribe the IRGC and the fact that Iran and Qatar both fund Hamas and proxies, and by doing so, that Qatar is biased and certainly should not be acting as a mediator in trying to achieve any settlement.
So they should be saying exactly that they should be pointing those facts out to the public in Great Britain. I'd remind you of the questioner raises the issue of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. If I'm not mistaken, 2 weeks ago, the Australian government actually had declared them a terrorist organization because there was clear evidence, the Australians say, that in attacks on the Jewish community, they'd been financed and supported and even instigated by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And so that they are involved in terrorism and as a terrorist organization, I think is indisputable. And I think they should be declared a terrorist organization.
Thank you. The last of the pre-organized questions is from Sharon Vardy and Michael Goldberg, members of the NJA. How do you suggest that we can take back the public relations narrative, given that Israel has shown itself to be deficient in presenting its case to the world and the optics are very poor?
So the optics are poor because Hamas controls the pictures that come out of Gaza. And I want the audience on this to understand. The only journalists working in Gaza today are Palestinian Gaza journalists who work for the BBC or work for Sky or work for Reuters or work for CNN. And they're not journalists who can work in a free, independent society. And as a result, they work under the compulsion of an authoritarian regime, the Hamas regime. And I'd ask you the obvious question, you don't have to answer, but how many of you have seen pictures of injured children since this war started almost 2 years ago? And everyone puts up their hand. We've all seen pictures of injured Gaza children. And I'll ask you the other question, how many of you have seen pictures of injured Hamas fighters, injured Hamas terrorists? And the answer is, no one's seen those pictures. Why? Because Hamas doesn't want you to see those pictures. Why is it that Israel said there are tunnels under hospitals and there are command and control centers under hospitals? No pictures. Only when Israel actually took over the area of the hospital and allows journalists to go in, do you see the pictures? There was a famous story from the last round of fighting before this one, I think it was in 2014, where 2 journalists from India came into Gaza, and on their first night inside Gaza, they heard noise outside their hotel room. They opened up the curtains and they saw 2 Hamas terrorists preparing and then shooting a rocket into Israel. And they took pictures, and the pictures were broadcast on an Indian network. And then the BBC, CNN, everyone picked up those pictures from the Indian network. Now, the 2 Indian journalists were told to leave Gaza immediately. They said, you're not safe in Gaza. Hamas said they broke all the rules of good coverage, yes, and they were forced out. True story. But then you have to ask the following question, Gary. Why is it that the BBC bureau in Gaza and the CNN bureau in Gaza and the Reuters bureau in Gaza and the AP never got pictures? Is it just the Indians had good luck, or, and this is what I know to be true, in Gaza, it is an authoritarian society. You could even argue it's like a totalitarian society because it's an authoritarian society with a very extreme ideology. And there's no such thing as the free press in Gaza. Gazan journalists, if they take pictures of things, let's say they took pictures of tunnels that Hamas didn't want pictures taken of, yes, and so forth and so on, then they wouldn't be journalists the next day. You don't know what sort of retribution they would
be dead the next day.
I heard one former journalist, a man who used to work for the Associated Press, he said 1/3 of the Palestinian journalists in Gaza, 1/3 are sympathetic to Hamas, 1/3 are intimidated by Hamas, and 1/3 are actually Hamas, right? and the whole illusion that there's somehow a free press in Gaza reporting. I sometimes hear a story in British media, they'll do a human interest story on a 12-year-old girl who's I don't know, she's posting on Instagram what's going on with her and her family, and it's presented as something authentic. I don't think it's authentic, because the minute she said something against Hamas, she wouldn't be posting on Instagram anymore.
Is there anything we can do to change the narrative here at all?
It's difficult. It's very difficult because it's like it's blowing against the wind. The narrative is so powerful. The most important thing, Gary, is that we win this. If we win on the battlefield, then everything else falls into place. And if we have to, and I'm going to say this again, but you remember I told you the Golda Meir story. The most important thing is that we win the war. And if we can win the war, and we will, then everything else will fall into place. If we don't win the war, nothing else matters. And if there's a bit of bad publicity along the way, so be it.
Yes, yes. A bit like the story after the Battle of Britain in 1940, when Britain won, Winston Churchill was contacted by some American journalists who said, look, the Germans are saying you've massively exaggerated all the figures. The Germans did far better than you're saying. And Churchill simply replied, look, if I'm right, they'll give up. If I'm wrong, they'll be in London in a week. It's the same idea. Anyway, now let's go on to questions from the audience. Barry Epstein, you're first. Barry, come off mute, please. Sorry, Barry, you're on mute. Steve, can you get Barry off mute? Is that possible? No? In which case, I'll ask Paul and Ruth.
He should be able to unmute himself.
Barry, can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Okay, off you go.
First of all, good evening, Mark. First of all, we've heard a lot about Swifties recently. I am a Regev. And when you say that Israel has a frapta force that nobody's heard about yet, I'm afraid it's you, and you behave just like the Australian fast bowlers. You're lethal and you tell it how it is. And now my question. You might have heard this evening that Ireland is mounting a campaign for European countries to pull out of next year's Eurovision Song Contest. I know my history, and I know an awful lot of the New Testament. Would it be an idea for the Israeli government not to give visas to anybody from Southern Ireland going to Jerusalem next year to join in the Stations of the Cross at Easter time?
Thank you, Barry. Mark.
I think that'd be a decision Israel would never take. Because one of the things that we say about Jerusalem and Jerusalem as Israel's capital is that only since Israel reunited the city in 1967 has there been freedom of worship for all, have all the religious communities autonomously run, their religious institutions, and it's something we firmly believe in, the idea of freedom of religion. Before 1967, Jews were forbidden
yes,
at the Western Wall. And so I think to limit worship is just something off the table for Israelis. We wouldn't agree to that. Are we, the Irish, I'll tell you a joke about Ireland, yes? The Irish, I mean, I watched the coverage on Ireland and from Ireland of the conflict. It's so one-sided, it's almost sick. The whole atmosphere in the Republic of Ireland is so anti-Israel. It really is, you have to ask, yes? What's this all about? There was a time when they liked us, yes, when Mr. Begin and Mr. Shamir were fighting the British to make Israel an independent country. Then the Irish loved us. But ever since then, it's been downhill in our relations with Ireland. I'll tell you a story about Ireland. I like to tell this to Irish people. They never have a good answer. At the end of the Second World War, Hitler committed suicide. And there was an Irish embassy in Dublin because Ireland was neutral. And the Prime Minister of Ireland, Mr. De Valera, went to the embassy and signed the condolence book. He didn't have to do that. There was no obligation for him to do that, but he went and signed the condolence book. Now, that he made a mistake all those years ago, fine. But, until today, Irish leadership is not willing to condemn him for doing that. The Nazi dictator who orchestrated the murder of a third of the Jewish people right? 6 million Jews. And can I tell you, when Deliver signed the book in May, it's after Buchenwald had been liberated and after Auschwitz had been liberated, and all the pictures were there for everyone to see. It was all on, they didn't have television then, but they had newsreels that were shown before movies. Everyone had seen the pictures. And De Valera, the Irish Prime Minister, still goes and signs the condolence book, saying that Germans have lost, I don't know what he wrote exactly, but something nice about Hitler, yes? Why can't the Irish government today say he did the wrong thing? They refuse to do so. They refuse to do so.
Thank you, Mark. Paul and Ruth
Thank you.
Hart. Can you come off mute, please? Paul and Ruth Hart.
Of Tov, Mark. Many of us think that perhaps Hamas is more interested in killing Israelis than actually any possible state, one or two. Do you think they're hoping to run down the clock so that all the hostages will just die before the next UN General Assembly, and the nations that would recognise Palestine are off the hook because there are no more negotiations to be made in exchange for lives?
Mark.
So first of all, we do know for a fact that a lot of the hostages have been killed in captivity, right? That's an unfortunate reality. I think, though, Hamas obviously is mistreating, and we saw the terrible pictures of the way our hostages are looking in their propaganda videos, in their psychological war videos. On one hand, you'd think logic would say they should keep the hostages alive so they have this asset that they can use against us, yes, and to demand all sorts of things to get the hostages back. So it's a difficult issue, and I feel for the hostage families, yes? I mean, how would I be, Mark Regev, if my daughter was being held in Gaza or by Hamas? Yes, you can only feel for the families. But here we have to say the truth. Who are these people? Yes, who kidnap civilians and hold them hostage? Remember, they kidnap children. They kidnap the elderly. They kidnapped a Holocaust survivor. What sort of, who are these people? My Prime Minister uses the word barbarians, yes? And maybe that word is appropriate when you talk about this sort of behavior, yes? They really are barbarians. And we have to know always what we're fighting against. And the truth is, that is why, and this is why I think a lot of people in Europe are wrong who just say ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. A ceasefire that leaves these people in power in Gaza. Not only are they condemning Israelis to a future October 7th, but they're ultimately condemning the Palestinian population of Gaza to this Taliban-type regime that instead of building schools and hospitals for the people of Gaza, spends all its energy on on a jihad against Israel. The people of Gaza. If you say you're a friend of the Palestinians, right? A lot of Europeans say, well, I'm a friend of the Palestinians. If you really are a friend of the Palestinians, you'd say Palestinians in Gaza deserve better than this extremist, fanatical, kamikaze type government that they have under Hamas.
Thank you. Konstantinos Dexiades. Konstantinos.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Good evening, all. I'm not Jewish and I'm not Israeli. I'm actually Greek. I was on the two marches. I was on the Saturday march, and also was on the Harlem in Downing Street march. So I've got three questions, and the first one is, I'm angry with our government, right? Now, they want to do a Palestinian state. I don't agree with that. So I've got three questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, but be very quick because there's lots of people waiting to ask.
Yeah. First of all, for Hamas, if they release the hostages, Israel wouldn't allow things to happen, which I agree with. You're not going to negotiate. You can't negotiate with these idiots, these terrorists. It's impossible. Two, what I find is the BBC, all the news media are very biased. I get my information directly from Israel. So I've got friends of mine who live in Israel, right? And they're also Israeli. Now, the thing is, with the media not being honest with the people, that shows that is wrong. Everyone's very biased against Israel, and I think that's completely wrong. The news should be done properly. So who actually controls what is said to the British people Because if I can get my information direct and saying there's rockets being fired, however, no one's reporting that, and I'm getting that information directly from Israel. So how is that fair? And how do you guys feel with the
Okay,
media?
can you let Mark answer, please? Mark.
So I said before how Hamas can manipulate the message coming out of Gaza because they have all the pictures, all the power of an authoritarian regime. I think it's a pity that when those pictures are shown in Britain, they're like considered like objective. I'll give you another example. And I mean, I'm pointing to a problem, but I don't have a solution. But let's say, I remember that in the first months of the war, Israel would stand up and say, "We know, yes, we know that under this hospital, Hamas has established a military command center, and they keep their weapons, and they were holding hostages there. We know that for a fact." And then a Palestinian journalist in Gaza goes to the hospital and interviews some doctor, and the doctor says, "I've never seen anything." And the head of the hospital says, "I've never seen any Hamas in my hospital," right? And a nurse in the hospital says, "I've never seen anything like this." But what can these people say? What would happen to someone who says, Hamas has taken over the hospital? Yes, that's the bottom line. People don't understand. It's an authoritarian society. Hamas is not a liberal political movement. It's not a democratic political movement. If you say something that they don't like, you will pay a price. And that's sort of ignored, I think, in a lot of the coverage. A lot of the coverage.
Okay, thank you. Steph Sweeney. Steph, could you come off mute, please?
Sorry. Hello.
Hello, Steph.
It's actually Steph's dad, Larry. First of all, good evening, Mark. It's good to see you again. We met some years ago in the Montcalm Hotel in London and also at St. David's in Manchester. So before I ask Mark my question, I want to commend Mark for the very eloquent way he handled the question from Barry about people from Southern Ireland, and guess where I'm from. You'd never guess, right? As is my daughter. So people from Southern Ireland being maybe denied visas to visit Jerusalem. Mark answered it very fairly and very eloquently. Not everybody in Southern Ireland is anti-Israel. I am a passionate Zionist and very proud to be a passionate Zionist. Sadly, it seems to me, and I live in the UK, that indeed the majority, well, certainly in government circles.
Oh, we seem to have lost you. Have we lost you?
Hello? Hello?
Back.
I don't know if you got all that, gentlemen. Did you?
Mark, can you comment?
I was going to say,
the trouble is I didn't hear a question.
okay. All right, Mark. So I'm going over all ground. My question is this. How can our government in the UK say they will recognise a Palestinian state? Where are the defined borders of this imaginary state? Where is the capital of this imaginary state? Who do we negotiate with as the government of this imaginary state? And how on earth does this idea to recognise a Palestinian state comply with the Montevideo Convention? That's my question.
Thank you very much, Mark.
So I think they're recognizing a virtual state. Yes, everyone understands that there is no Palestinian state. And some of them maybe sincerely believe that by recognizing a Palestinian state, they're advancing peace. But as I explained before, it's the exact opposite. They're pushing peace further away. Because if you're just, if you're encouraging Palestinians to continue with their current behavior, to continue to be extreme, never to make a concession, and they can still get recognition, why would they ever change their behavior? You're reinforcing bad Palestinian behavior. I want to remind, it's not just in 1937 when the Jews accepted and the Palestinian leadership rejected the first partition proposal proposed by the Peel Commission, yes? It's not just in 1947 that the Palestinian leadership refused the UN partition proposals, once again accepted by Israel, that would have created a Palestinian state next to a Jewish state. But in more recent times, at Camp David in 2000, when President Clinton tried to negotiate an agreement, the Palestinians said no. And when Yehuda Olmert put these very, very forthcoming proposals on the table, and Condoleezza Rice said this is a historic proposal, and she goes to Ramallah, and the Palestinian leader, the current President Abbas, he says, no way. or basically did nothing. He didn't want to negotiate. And even more recently, maybe the most pro-Palestinian president in American history, Barack Obama, sends Kerry to negotiate agreements and puts things on the table, and the Palestinians still say no. And so I think the fundamental problem here is the Palestinians, it's not about creation of a Palestinian state, it's about the existence of a Jewish state.
Exactly.
Are Palestinians willing to accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state? Because if
No.
they
No.
had been willing to do so, a Palestinian state would have been established in 1948 alongside Israel, and they'd be like, we're going to, celebrate Israel's Independence Day in next May. They'd be celebrating their Independence Day, but always consistently the Palestinian leadership has said no to a Palestinian state if it meant accepting the legitimacy of the Jewish state. And that was true in 1937 when there was still a British mandate. And unfortunately, we saw it very recently, as I just said. There's something about Palestinian nationalism, unfortunately, which is more about ending Israel than creating a Palestine. And that's the bottom line. And people have to understand that. Now, having said that, and I apologize, Gary, that I'm on a monologue now, yes? If people really want to advance peace in the Middle East, so we can get a ceasefire in Gaza, we can try to make some sort of modus vivendi, yes? That'll be good. Good for Israelis, good for Palestinians in Gaza. I'm in favor of that. But a real peace breakthrough with the Palestinians is not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately.
Okay.
Where can there be an effort? Where is it worthwhile putting energy in? Relationships between Israel and the larger Arab world. President Trump has talked about expanding the Abraham Accords. President Biden's team worked very intensively on trying to get a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That is doable. That is a realistic goal to try to find Arab and Muslim countries who are willing to upgrade their relationship with Israel. And that can happen. And when this war in Gaza is open, I believe it will happen. And that, I think, is where the energy, you can create a strong Israeli-Arab rapprochement, a sort of a coexistence. I mean, if someone like Saudi Arabia normalized ties with Israel, that's a huge breakthrough. And so I think the effort should be placed there. And ultimately, the Palestinians see themselves as an integral element of the Arab world. And if the Arab world is increasingly recognizing Israel and increasingly normalizing its ties with Israel, yes, that has to affect the Palestinians, maybe not immediately, but in the medium term or the long term. That's where the political energy should be spent, because that's a strategy that can work. But if you say Palestinian state now, yes, it's just not going to happen. Israelis aren't ready for it. Israelis don't want it, because we saw what happened. Look, one last thing, and then I'll allow the next question. I apologize, Gary, but I'm on a roll here, and I apologize.
No, Mark. Keep going, please.
Carry on, Mark.
If you read British newspapers, not all of them, but some of them, basically the Israelis are stupid. Why are we stupid? We don't understand what's good for us. We don't understand that if we pulled out back to the 1967 borders and we took down all the settlements, everything would be hunky-dory. Just take down the settlements and go back to the 67 lines. That's all Israel has to do, and we will live in peace with our neighbors. And what's the trouble? Israelis say, be there, done that. What did we do in Gaza? What did Ariel Sharon do in Gaza? He took down all the settlements, all of them, every last one. The settlers who didn't want to leave, the Israeli government forcibly evacuated them. And what line did we return to? To the 67 line. And then, according to the logic of this simplistic sort of thing that you hear sometimes, in Britain and so forth, take down settlements, go back to 67 lines. Gaza should be our most quiet and peaceful border. Hello? What's going on here?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mark. Les Bloom.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Les Bloom.
Oh, hello. Yes. Hi. Yes. Okay. I'm very concerned that Israel is losing media war. I'm really concerned about it. It's wonderful what the NGA and the other people do to support the cause. There's been Zoom and in-house, and that is great, as I say. But my big concern is that you are preaching to the converted. Everybody listening to this is already converted. So I understand that the people shouting "River to the Sea," it's impossible to make any headway with them. But there's a lot of people that are just sort of in the middle, and they're getting words like genocide poured into their ears, and which is, as we all know, totally wrong. I understand writing to the MP is useful, but it's not winning over the public. So my question is, what should we, the people listening to this talk now, do to win over the British public to have more empathy with Israel?
Thank you, Mark.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. I'm not in Britain. Once I used to live there when I was the ambassador, and I knew all about British politics and what was going on. I'm now living far away, and I can only speculate, yes? I just have to know we have to keep making our case. We have to keep making our case. And I think it's, if Gary doesn't mind me saying this, it is important to speak to groups of people who support us. It's important to strengthen your base, right? And then to try to enlarge your base. I don't think that's a waste of my time. I wouldn't do it if I thought it was a waste of my time.
Oh, I'm not saying it's no. I'm very appreciative of what you're doing. Yeah.
I know public opinion in Britain is very hostile. In many ways. I suppose if I was watching some of the British networks and only watching the British networks and nothing else, I would be hostile myself too, because of the way the issue is portrayed. We have to keep making our case and not give up. That's the bottom line.
Thank you.
Where do we make this case,
Sorry,
Mark?
can we move on because we've only got limited time? Elizabeth Belisha, please. Elizabeth, could you come off mute? Elizabeth Belisha. No, are you not there? In which case, can I? Oh, you are there. Come off mute, please, Elizabeth. Please. No, in which case I'll move to Adam Burns. Adam. Oh,
Can you?
Belisha is here now. Okay, Elizabeth, carry on. Ask your question.
Okay. I'm a French Israeli, and I was wondering, Marco Rubio said that he has revoked the visa of Mahmoud Abbas and the other PA representatives to come to the General Assembly in New York. I was wondering, is there any chance that he could do the same with Macron? Or is it fantasy? Because, I mean, it is arguable that France, and especially Macron, are in fact supporting or being very complacent with terrorists such as Hamas, Hezbollah, or ICRG. And it is arguable to say that this is contrary to the United States interests.
Okay, Mark, your view.
So what I can say is the following. I heard Marco Rubio say very clearly that he thinks what the French are doing and what the British are doing and what the Canadians are doing in recognizing a Palestinian is a huge mistake and counterproductive. And thank goodness the Americans are standing by Israel. It's very important. It's not the first time. I said before, in the 1973 war, Europe turned its back on Israel to a great extent, and America was there for us as well. We're the only country in the world, I think, that's been helped by America that doesn't have this populistic anti-Americanism that you get across Europe and places like Canada and Australia, this sort of trendy anti-Americanism. It's interesting, though, that the Americans have denied visas to the Palestinians. And I think that's a way of putting pressure on them to change their behavior. I think they do need to have pressure on them to change their behavior. There's too much pressure. The pressure's all put on Israel, like it's our fault that October 7th happened, yes?
Okay.
Yes, but can they deny visa to Macron?
Look, legally they can they can deny a visa to anyone. I'm not sure, it's going to happen anytime soon. I think it might be a bit of overreach, if I can be frank. Yes, it seemed to be.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Adam Burns. Adam, could you come off mute, please?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Gary. Good evening, Mark. Thank you for your time. My question is with regards to the hostages and any proposed or potential deal as such. You did touch on just before with regards to the normalization and treaties with Arab states and in the medium and long term, where I think, generally speaking, with Arab states, they have a clearer and better understanding of things as opposed to Western countries. With regards to, as I say, the hostages in any deal, and as much as where America recognizes, I believe, and publicly recognizes the elimination of Hamas, and that being one of Israel's goals. If a deal were to be made with Hamas to release the hostages, and obviously it being unconfirmed whether any existing leaders in Qatar are still existing themselves or not, understanding also there is a diplomatic and international, if not political, front from the Arab states in terms of being united in that sense. In making a deal with Hamas and then them ultimately being eliminated, to release the hostages, I understand, is one of the primary prerogatives and goals. But if there was a deal to then release however many thousands of terrorists with Hamas in that deal, and then Hamas being eliminated, understanding perhaps the diplomatic or diplomacy of that, it is that and of itself somewhat counterproductive, knowing even in the elimination of Hamas, this isn't necessarily going to end in the short and medium term.
Thank you. Can Mark answer now? Mark.
Yeah, I mean, if we had a deal with Hamas that ends the war, it'd be a deal like the remaining Hamas leadership could, let's say, leave the Gaza Strip, and they could go and live with their friends in Qatar or in Turkey or something like that. But they would leave, yes? And Gaza would be disarmed and the hostages would be released. That's the sort of deal that Israel's willing to do. And we'd allow, it's a bit like 1982, Arafat leaving Beirut and all this. So they'd be allowed to leave in the framework of us getting all the hostages back. But Israel cannot give up on the idea that Hamas controls Gaza. I think that wouldn't work. We have to have a situation when this is over that Hamas doesn't run Gaza and that Gaza is demilitarized. That's the bottom line. I don't know if any of you have been to Israel before and that you've seen the communities that were brutalized and suffered so much violence on the border, right? How can people go back and live in those communities if Hamas is on the other side of the frontier? It's not going to happen. And it's crucial that when this is over, we get all the hostages back, those that are alive return to their families and so forth, those that are unfortunately not among the living, that their families get closure, that they get a decent burial. That's also important. But ultimately, Hamas cannot be allowed to be in power in Gaza, and Gaza cannot continue to be this threat to Israel. We want a new reality in Gaza, and I think, once again, I'm repeating myself, I think that new reality is actually good for the Palestinians of Gaza, who deserve better than this terrible, terrible Hamas regime that has only brought them suffering and pain and bloodshed.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions. So, Andrew McCutcheon. Andrew, could you come off mute, please?
Hamas is everywhere, sir.
Hello?
Hello, Andrew.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
I still see other people on the screen.
No. Yeah, we're waiting for your question.
Okay, right. Question. Hopefully quite straightforward. Some families of terrorists have escaped from Gaza through tunnels under the border to Egypt. What if some of the hostages have been taken by the same route? If that was true, what would Israel do? Is that a task for Mossad or some other agency to pursue?
Mark.
So first of all, there were those stories like that out there. I don't know if they're true or not. I suppose it's hypothetically possible. And then it would be up to the security services to try to find them if they're somewhere abroad. But I don't believe it's true. I think if it's true, we'd already know it. And as far as I know, it's not true.
Okay, thank you. Simon Redding. Simon, good to see you again, my friend. Simon, come off mute.
Gary, first of all, I'd like to say that I only wish the BBC would give more airtime to Mark Regev, because I personally think that his answers are some of the best answers I've heard. Now, just a small comment before I ask the question. In 1956, you mentioned that Israel and the UK had the closest possible relationship.
Well, closer than we've had.
Yeah, and I'm coming to a question. And the reason may be that the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs happened to be a Jew, a man called Gerald Isaacs. And the trouble is, of course, that the Foreign Office have always historically been anti-Semitic. And it was one of the few times when we had a Minister of State who was Jewish. So that was just a small point. But the real point, and you may have covered this, Mark, before, but I wanted to know, who are the Arab mediators that you mentioned were helping America in solving the problem with Qatar? I don't know whether there are which particular Arab mediators in which countries. Do you know?
So I was talking about the mediators.
Sorry, was something wrong? Hello, carry on, Mark. Speak.
I was talking about the mediators who are trying to help us get the hostages out, and that is both the Egyptians and the Qataris themselves. But as President Trump said recently, the Americans also have now a direct dialogue with Hamas, and so we'll see how this works. But that's the only effort in town that seems to be working. Everything else is hot air.
Yes, yeah.
Thank
so
you.
UAE, what position do they hold as far as the mediation is concerned with Qatar? And do you think?
Once again, there are members like Qatar of the Gulf Cooperation Council. That's the group, I think it's of 6 Gulf Arab states that have this sort of group, but they've had over the last few years a very difficult relationship with Qatar. Qatar has supported elements in the Arab world, the more extreme Islamic elements that have annoyed its neighbors. Like I've been to the UAE, I presume you have too. Very, very globalized, very outward looking, very modernistic, yes. They want to be part of the world. You know, a lot of us have traveled on Emirates Airlines and so forth. The Qataris are in a different place. The Qataris want to get the benefits of the West and yet still have a good relationship with Iran and have a good relationship with the Taliban. They like to play all against each other, and they've had a difficult relationship with their Arab neighbors over the last few years. I even think there'll be something in Qatar next week where everyone will come and show solidarity with Qatar. But I think under the table, once again, I don't think there might be a few of the Arab countries on the in the Gulf who are sort of saying, you know, Israel gave them what they deserved. Now, once again, we didn't attack Qatar. We attacked Hamas inside Qatar, the same way that President Obama in 2011, he didn't attack Pakistan, he attacked Osama bin Laden, who was inside Pakistan. I think there's an important difference there.
And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood basically run Qatar, don't they?
Correct. They've been funding and supporting. That's one of the reasons there was so much tension between the other Arab countries and Qatar, because they were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Correct.
Thank you. My apologies to everyone else who wants to ask a question. We are now out of time. So in a moment, I'd just like to ask Keith Rowe, our vice chairman of the NJA, to propose a motion of thanks. Before Keith starts talking, just to say we're going to have at least 3 more Zoom meetings in October and November. And we have a Hanukkah party on the 16th of December, which you'll all be told about in the near future. So can I hand over to Keith, please?
Good evening. Hello, Mark. And on behalf of the NJA, I would really like to thank you profusely for taking so much time out of your busy schedule to be with us this evening. I've heard you speaking on a number of occasions. You've always given insightful, thorough and easily understandable answers to some insurmountable problems that are often put your way. A few minutes ago, you said that you now live a long way away and that you're not totally up to speed with politics, internal politics here in the United Kingdom. Well, can I tell you that looking at the British government here at the moment, Israel's government seems positively stable and extremely well organized. So perhaps you're in a great place where you are. You've been really concise and put in a really clear way the objectives of the Israeli government to see the end of Hamas and get the hostages back. And for me, one of the things that you've done that's pleased me so much is that you've confirmed the irrelevance of the British government in this current peace process. They've made themselves irrelevant through, as you said, their virtue signaling. So it's really good to hear someone in your position confirming really that whatever our David Lammy and all the others have said is just totally irrelevant and not taken any notice of. I suspect that the British government at the moment is a bit of a laughing stock on the world stage. And one of the other things that you've done very clearly this evening is explained again, a very easily understandable way, the reasons for what seems to us such poor PR coming from Israel. And thank you for making the reasons for all this so clear. From my point of view, there are too few people like you on our media. So, you know, if you want to come back to the UK in whatever capacity, appear on our screens a bit more often, and certainly perhaps appear on the NJA screens again, then that would be extremely welcome by me, and I'm sure by everybody watching this evening. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
It was my pleasure, my pleasure. And I thank
once again, my apologies to those who didn't get a chance to ask questions. But thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate your spending time with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.